Welcome to the Deep Dive, the show that acts as your analytical shortcut, taking the most complex geopolitical and strategic sources and distilling them into essential knowledge.
Today, we are definitely diving deep. We're looking at one of the most volatile regions on the planet.
That's right. We aren't just analyzing a theoretical conflict. We are peering into the blueprint for a potential war in one of the world's most tense nuclear flashpoints, the border between India and Pakistan.
And we're focusing on a modern military concept that has really dominated strategic thinking in South Asia for nearly 2 decades now. India's very provocative cold start doctrine, or CSD.
The core of our discussion today is tackling the argument that this strategy, which was designed for a limited conventional war, might actually be a blueprint for a nuclear catastrophe.
Fast track to one, yeah.
And our guide through this incredibly high-stakes scenario is a really insightful piece of analysis, and it comes from the operational side of the fence, which I think is crucial.
Absolutely.
We're looking at an article titled, "Cold Start is Too Hot." It was published back in March 2011, and it was written by Commander Mohammad Azam Khan, retired from the Pakistan Navy.
And this is what makes the source so compelling. This isn't just, some academic commentary from thousands of miles away.
Exactly.
Commander Khan brings a crucial, experienced perspective to this. He's a senior research fellow at the Pakistan Navy War College in Lahore. But more importantly, you have to look at his career.
Right.
He held several command and staff appointments in the Pakistan Navy. This gives him direct, first-hand insight into the very operational culture he's analyzing.
So he's seen it from the inside.
He's lived it. I mean, he participated in key national exercises like Sea Spark and Shamsheer-e-Bahr. Think about that. He was literally involved in planning and testing Pakistan's responses to the very threats that he's writing about. So his critique of Cold Start, it's really mandatory reading for anyone who wants to understand this conflict.
So, our mission for this deep dive is clear. We need to understand the intent behind CSD India's goal of achieving these rapid, punitive strikes while supposedly staying below the nuclear threshold.
Supposedly, yes.
And then we need to examine why Commander Khan argues this high-speed, high-stakes game is, and I'm quoting him here, flirting with Armageddon.
It's a powerful phrase. And the foundational reality here, the thing you can never forget, is the nuclear backdrop.
Of course.
Both India and Pakistan are self-declared nuclear powers. The Kashmir issue has been this dangerous recurring flashpoint for, since 1947, decades. CSD is an attempt to rewrite the rules of conflict in this nuclearized environment. But it didn't just appear out of nowhere. It emerged directly from a very specific and, for India, a very humiliating strategic failure that they had to fix.
Okay, let's unpack that. So before Cold Start, India's strategic posture, it relied on mass mobilization, right? These huge, slow-moving army corps.
Exactly. The old British model, really.
So what was the specific monumental failure that proved that this traditional approach was just obsolete in a nuclearized South Asia?
That failure was Operation Paracram. It translates to something like valor or courage, and it spanned from 2001 to 2002.
And this was in response to what exactly?
It was India's massive, almost visceral response to the December 18, 2001 terrorist attack on the Indian parliament. This was meant to be an immediate, overwhelming show of force.
And it was, from what I remember, an immense military undertaking. I think it was described as the largest mobilization India had launched since the 1971 war.
Absolutely. The Indian government ordered a full mobilization. And this was classic coercive diplomacy.
The idea of using military threats to force your opponent to change their behavior.
Precisely. The goal was to compel Pakistan to shut down militant training camps, hand over individuals involved in terrorism, that sort of thing.
Right.
The Indian Air Force activated all its forward operating bases. The Navy's Western Fleet was aggressively reinforced with strike elements brought over from the Eastern Fleet. They deployed in this really high-stakes, deterrent posture across the Arabian Sea.
So on paper, that sounds like a textbook example of deterrence. You mass your forces, you signal your intent, you wait for the other side to back down. Why did this enormous show of strength just fall apart and end up being classified as a strategic failure?
Because in a crisis, speed is leverage, and India had none. The entire operation ultimately ended almost 10 months later in a quiet disengagement, without India achieving any meaningful strategic or political gains.
10 months.
10 months. And the primary, most cited reason was the sheer amount of time it took to just get the forces in place.
Okay, give us the timeline again. How long did it actually take for that main conventional force to become combat ready on the border?
It took more than 3 weeks. Over 21 days for India's 3 critical strike corps to travel from their peacetime locations which were often deep in eastern and central India, all the way to their wartime positions along the Pakistan border. This lengthy, grinding movement. It just completely negated any possibility of surprise.
3 weeks is an eternity in a modern crisis. That's enough time for the entire world to notice, to intervene, and for your opponent to get fully prepared.
It is. And the consequences of that delay for India's coercive diplomacy effort were devastating.
I can imagine.
First, it entirely stripped India of strategic surprise. The slow, massive movement of these corps was a clear signal of the general thrust of the operation. You could practically see it from space.
So Pakistan knew exactly what was coming.
They did. And this gave Pakistan ample time to do two critical things, both of which just completely undermined India's goals. First, Pakistan successfully internationalized the crisis. They brought global diplomatic pressure led primarily by the U.S. at that point, post 9/11, to bear on India, preventing an immediate, large-scale conflict.
So they used diplomacy as a shield.
A very effective one. And second, they used that time to complete their own defensive mobilization and send a very clear, very credible retaliatory message back to India. Any attack inside its portion of Kashmir or across the international border would be met with an appropriate and potentially escalatory response.
So the very concentration of force that was supposed to frighten Pakistan ended up being this giant, slow-motion signal that told the whole world exactly what India was trying to do.
Precisely. India invested immense resources, they mobilized hundreds of thousands of troops, and at the end of the day they lost face because the military strategy, which was based on this Cold War era massive core concentration idea, was just fundamentally faulty for the new reality of a nuclear-armed subcontinent.
And out of that failure, Cold Start was born.
Exactly. It was announced shortly after Paracram's failure, around 2004, and it was the direct, deliberate solution to this fatal time-space gap.
So Cold Start is India's attempt to restore that conventional option in a nuclear environment. It's a foundational shift away from their old defense-oriented posture.
Right. It's a move toward one that prioritizes rapid, punitive, and limited offensive operations. The whole thing is designed to be executable before any of that diplomatic or, God forbid, nuclear pressure can even materialize.
What specifically is the objective of this limited war? Is it conquest or is it something else?
It is not conquest in the traditional sense. No one is talking about planting a flag in Islamabad. The overall vision is a limited war. Swift, decisive strikes that are executed in response to a specified provocation.
Like another major terrorist attack.
That's the most cited example, yes. Terrorism from Pakistan-based militant groups, or maybe localized incursions, something like the 1999 Kargil conflict. The military goal is very narrowly defined. Destruction of Pakistan's military potential in a chosen sector, but with limited manageable collateral damage.
But the political goal seems to be the real driver here. You mentioned achieving post-conflict concessions. That's the key, isn't it?
Absolutely. The military action is just a means to a political end. CSD seeks to gain limited territorial leverage.
How much territory are we talking about?
Specifically, they're aiming for penetrations between 30 and 50 miles deep. This is territory that India's planners believe they can secure very quickly and then hold.
And the political purpose of holding that ground?
It's to create undeniable leverage, to force Pakistan to comply with demands, things like handing over suspected terrorists, dismantling training camps, or accepting new terms for ceasefire agreements, all before the international community can fully intervene and force a mutual disengagement.
So if Paracram was slow mobilization leading to political failure, Cold Start is the exact opposite. It's the attack first, mobilize later mechanism. How is the speed actually achieved on an operational level?
Well, it's achieved by structurally abandoning those slow-moving, massive strike corps. They're just too cumbersome. The key innovation is the use of smaller, highly agile, self-contained fighting formations. They're known as integrated battle groups, or IBGs.
The IBGs, these are the core operational units of Cold Start.
They are.
Can you elaborate on the structure of these IBGs for our listeners? What does integrated really mean in this context?
Right. So you can think of them as roughly brigade-sized formations, but they possess significantly enhanced combat power compared to a standard brigade. They're integrated because they're designed from the ground up to function as an independent joint force package.
So it's not just infantry and tanks?
No, not at all. It means the Army strike elements, so your mechanized infantry and your armor, are permanently linked with all their essential combat support. That means air defense, engineers, artillery, and reconnaissance elements are all part of the same unit, training and fighting together.
And this is a tri-service concept.
Critically, yes. They are backed by naval and Air Force assets from day one, particularly in the southern sector.
So these IBGs are designed to hit fast and hard. Where are they located, and what is the window of attack they're aiming for?
This is the other key difference. Unlike the old Corps, which were garrisoned far away in central India, these IBGs are positioned much, much closer to the borders. This drastically reduces their transit time.
Which allows for that surprise element that was missing in Paragram.
And not just surprise, but multiplicity. This positioning allows them to be launched along multiple unpredictable axes, almost simultaneously. And they can do it within a shocking window of 72 to 96 hours of receiving the order to attack.
That 4-day window, that is the core strategic challenge that Cold Start poses. It's a direct and, frankly, a terrifying response to the 3 weeks Operation Paragram required.
It is the entire point of the doctrine. By shortening that decision-to-action cycle to less than 4 days, India aims to present the world, and more importantly Pakistan, with a fait accompli.
A done deal.
Exactly. A swift military result achieved before the UN Security Council can even meet, before the U.S. can deploy high-level mediators, and, crucially, before Pakistan can decide on a cohesive, non-escalatory military response.
Now, that level of speed and precision, it requires more than just organizational reform. You need massive technological investment. The source emphasized India's investment in what it called C4I networks.
Oh, absolutely. The success of CSD is entirely dependent on information dominance and rapid decision-making. C4I stands for Command, Control, Communications, Computers, and Intelligence.
A network of sensors and data.
A network of everything. And India firmed up this capability through a series of large-scale joint exercises like Divyastra and Ashwamedh. These drills were all about practicing instantaneous, real-time intelligence flow.
How does a system like that actually shave weeks off the planning process? What does it look like in practice?
Well, think about the old system. A satellite passes over, takes photos. The photos are sent to a central command for analysis. That analysis is filtered down a long chain of command, and then maybe days later, it's physically relayed to a corps commander in the field.
A process that's just too slow for this kind of war.
Right. Under CSD, they utilize a decentralized system. Information that's collected by all their dedicated assets. We're talking high-resolution satellites, unmanned aerial vehicles or UAVs providing constant surveillance, aerial reconnaissance radar networks, even communication intercepts. All of that raw data is processed and instantly transmitted in digital form directly to the forward-deployed IBG commander's digital display in his vehicle.
So the commander on the ground sees what the satellite sees, almost in real time.
That's the goal. This near-instantaneous flow of battlefield information, coupled with sophisticated electronic warfare systems to jam Pakistani communications, facilitates that speedy decision-making. It allows them to exploit weak points in Pakistan's defense the very moment they appear.
Okay, here's where the tension really ratchets up. How did Pakistan's military establishment react when this lightning-fast doctrine, which essentially negates their previous strategic time cushion, was formalized?
Well, the initial discussion started internally among Pakistani military planners around 2005. They recognized the grave implications of CSD almost immediately. But the issue was publicly forced into the spotlight following a very stark warning in 2010.
What was that specific statement that sounded the alarm?
It came from the Indian Army chief at the time, General Deepak Kapoor, in January 2010. His warning was, well, it was unambiguous. He said that the prospect of a limited war under the nuclear hangover is still very much a reality.
So he was confirming that Cold Start wasn't just a theoretical exercise on a whiteboard somewhere.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It confirmed that this was an active, viable option for India's military leadership. It was on the table.
And the high-level response from Pakistan was immediate.
Indeed. The Pakistan Army Chief, General Ashfaq Parvez Kayani, he articulated the core fear that really defines the strategic dilemma for them. He noted that CSD would allow India to execute an attack before Pakistan could even complete its own strategic mobilization.
Which increases the risk
of a sudden spiral escalation. The speed of Cold Start eliminates the time that's necessary for international diplomatic intervention to slow things down, to de-escalate. There's no off-ramp.
So Pakistan had to devise a counter-strategy. How did they go about practicing a defense against the simultaneous thrust of multiple IBGs?
Their major public response was an exercise called Azm-e-Nau 3, which means New Resolve. It was jointly conducted by the Army and the Air Force in the spring of 2010. This was an immense display of force, and it was designed specifically to test responses to CSD.
Walk us through the scale and the scenario of that operation. What did it involve?
It was huge. It involved somewhere between 20,000 and 50,000 troops operating all along the eastern border in key geographical sectors like Sialkot, the Khalistan Desert, and down in Sindh. The entire exercise was built around a mirror image of the Cold Start threat.
So they gamed it out.
They did.
Yeah.
They set up a scenario where the Foxland Army, which represented India's IBGs, suddenly invaded and occupied Blue Land territory, which was Pakistan.
And what was the core defensive tactic they tested against this invasion?
The counter tactic involved rapid, dispersed counterattacks. For instance, Blue Land's anti-tank battalions used aggressive dispersal tactics, trying to prevent the Foxland penetration from consolidating its gains, and then trying to swiftly regain the occupied territory.
It sounds like they were trying to fight speed with speed.
That's part of it. The exercise also included crucial elements like live weapon firing demonstrations and, interestingly, drone shoot-downs, integrating their ground and air assets to try and quickly neutralize the enemy's forward reconnaissance systems, that C4I advantage we talked about.
This really highlights the psychological and operational challenge that CSD creates for Pakistani planners. India might launch 8 of these IBGs, but Pakistan only has that 72 to 96-hour window to respond.
And that is the crucial, almost paralyzing dilemma. They have to correctly guess the main axis of attack, or, much more dangerously, they have to try and respond to all 8 potential thrusts simultaneously.
And if they get it wrong,
If they commit their limited mobile reserves to the wrong sector, they could lose valuable strategic ground in another sector within a matter of days. The speed and the multiplicity of the attack are specifically designed to overwhelm the decision-making cycle of the defender, forcing Pakistan to choose between absorbing a significant conventional loss or escalating the conflict.
and this is where we see that transition from conventional military planning into something existential. The need to make an irreversible decision within 72 hours under incredible duress is the real danger of CSD.
It is. The very existence of this fast strike option means that military planning is no longer about a protracted conventional war. It's about navigating a terrifying high-speed tripwire.
Now, while the main focus naturally falls on the land war, the image of IBGs penetrating the plains of Punjab Commander Khan's analysis, given his naval background, insists that the maritime implications are just as profound.
Oh, absolutely. He argues that this is a blind spot in a lot of Western analysis, especially since Pakistan has historically suffered from a weaker naval focus in its past conflicts.
So on the surface, what is the Indian Navy's official role within the Cold Start framework? It sounds supportive, not primary.
Ostensibly, yes. The official role is providing air cover for the IBGs, particularly in the southern sector.
Yeah.
It sounds almost trivial compared to the massive armored thrusts happening on land.
But the reality, as Khan sees it, is that the Indian Navy will be far from trivial. What is the true multidimensional problem the Indian Navy poses in a CSD scenario?
He argues that in any limited war, the Indian Navy will inevitably take a forward, aggressive posture. Its goal would be to impose a severe economic toll on Pakistan, thereby supporting the land objective through attrition.
How would they do that?
The most direct way is by imposing a distant blockade of Pakistani ports. They would look to interdict critical sea lines of communication, the SLOCs, emanating from the Red Sea or the Far East. In essence, they would try to choke off Pakistan's external trade, and most importantly, its energy imports.
That's coercive diplomacy applied to the sea lanes, and they have the assets to do it aggressively, particularly with advanced weaponry.
Yes. A major threat factor here is the deployment of their growing submarine fleet. These submarines are increasingly armed with the land attack variants of the supersonic BrahMos cruise missile.
And BrahMos is a game changer.
It really is, because of its extreme speed and its difficult detectability. So placing these submarines close to the Makran coast means they can quickly clog up sea traffic and even target coastal infrastructure, putting enormous pressure on Pakistan's entire supply chain.
This naval ambition, it speaks volumes about the level of tri-service synergy that India has managed to achieve. Where did that harmony originate?
It really solidified during the Kargil crisis in 1999. Before Kargil, cooperation between the Army, Navy, and Air Force was often, let's say, perfunctory. Each service kind of did its own thing. Kargil changed all of that. The Indian military realized that coordinated joint responses were absolutely essential to modern deterrence and warfighting.
And how did the Navy specifically demonstrate this during Kargil? I mean, that conflict was primarily fought in the high mountains.
Right. But the Navy executed an aggressive, forward-leaning deterrent action at sea that had a huge strategic effect. the Indian Navy immediately shifted the venue of its Eastern Fleet maneuvers, which are usually conducted in the Bay of Bengal, all the way over to the western seaboard, integrating fully with their Western Fleet.
So they concentrated their naval power right off Pakistan's coast.
They did. They conducted large-scale joint exercises in the North Arabian Sea, projecting strength and threatening Pakistan's maritime interests. And in a really surprising example of innovation, even when their main aircraft carrier was under refit, they demonstrated flexibility by utilizing a common container ship's deck as a makeshift platform for Sea Harrier aircraft trials. This unified deterrent posture set the standard for the kind of joint operations that now define CSD.
And how did the Pakistan Navy respond to that aggressive posture back in 1999?
The Pakistan Navy went on full alert. They had to immediately deploy all their available assets to safeguard their critical national maritime interests. Crucially, they began escorting convoys along their traditional sea lines, especially the Persian Gulf route.
Which is their economic lifeline.
It's their oil and gas lifeline. It's a strategic commodity that Pakistan's military and economy absolutely cannot function without. Furthermore, their planners developed contingency plans for things like P-3C Orion strikes on strategic points along India's eastern seaboard, showing that they recognized the two-front land and sea nature of the conflict.
So the lesson of Kargil for both sides was that the Navy is no longer a silent partner. It's an indispensable element of the overall pressure campaign.
Exactly. And that is why Commander Khan insists that any Pakistani doctrine that ignores or downplays the naval threat is doomed to repeat the strategic setbacks of the past.
Which brings us back to that critique of the Army-centric tradition in Pakistan. We see it in exercise Azm-e-Nau 3, where he said the Pakistan Navy was largely just an observer.
Right. And Commander Khan is highly critical of this land-centric mindset. He calls it a legacy of the British colonial era. And he labels the Navy's inconsequential role of observer in that exercise as a potentially fatal mistake.
So how is the Navy pushing back to ensure its relevance against this CSD threat?
The Navy realized that if the land war started, the only way to alleviate pressure on the Army was through diversionary actions at sea. This led directly to their own major exercise, Shamsheer-e-Bahr, the Faith, or Sea Sword.
When was this conducted, and what was its fundamental purpose in countering cold start?
It was a major conceptual exercise that concluded in late 2010. Its purpose was explicitly to assess the full spectrum of the Indian Navy threat, to evaluate all possible conflict scenarios under the Cold Start Doctrine, and to develop a comprehensive naval response strategy. It really represented a crucial shift in Pakistan's defense thinking.
And unlike the Army-led exercise, this one appears to have prioritized integration.
Absolutely. The planners recognized that the complexity and speed of CSD meant no future war could be won without genuine operational synergy. So Shamsheer-e-Bahr, the Faith, actively involved the 5th Corps of the Pakistan Army, which covers that critical southern land sector, and the Pakistan Air Force's Southern Air Command right from the planning stages.
So it was a true joint exercise.
It was a whole-of-nation war game, not just a service-specific drill. They even brought in relevant government departments.
And the duration and scope suggest it was incredibly detailed.
It was. It spread over 2.5 months, and it was systematically planned to move from a peace footing through a limited conflict scenario right up to a full war environment. The primary focus was that southern sector, which borders India and controls access to the Arabian Sea.
And the lessons learned from this?
The key insights gained here were intended to be implemented in their subsequent Navy-wide exercise called Sea Spark to fully formalize Pakistan's modern naval strategy.
Okay, let's talk specifics. If Cold Start is enacted, what are the actionable counter options for the Pakistan Navy that are suggested by this analysis?
They have 4 main objectives. First is creating diversions and fire effects. This means using their submarine fleet and air-launched missiles to harass Indian naval assets and draw their resources away from the land front.
Split their focus.
Exactly. Second, and most critical, is contesting the blockade. They have to protect their vital sea lines, particularly that Gulf artery, which is indispensable for their national energy security.
But protecting those lines against a larger Indian Navy seems incredibly difficult. Wouldn't a better strategy be to strike at India's own economic vulnerabilities?
That is the third pillar of their strategy, a counter-blockade. Since India threatens Pakistan's ports, Pakistan can threaten India's. The Navy can position its forces along the Strait of Hormuz and their western periphery on the Makran coast to try and force a counter-blockade of vital Indian shipping.
So you shift the economic pressure back onto India.
You try to. And the fourth pillar is striking at India's economic heartland. The focus here is heavily concentrated on the Gujarat-Maharashtra coast. The source even cites Prime Minister Jalani's statements, underscoring the security of these sea lines as essential to national prosperity. Any disruption here would cripple India's northern industrial belts.
Let's look at the numbers cited in the source just to understand the scale of this vulnerability.
The data is pretty staggering. Over 70% of India's oil imports arrive at ports along the Gujarat and Maharashtra coasts. The sheer volume of traffic makes them fragile targets.
What kind of volume are we talking about?
Well, in 2006-07 alone, 117 million tons of petroleum products transited the Gulf of Kutch, and another 95 million passed through Mumbai. Major oil refineries are all clustered in this region.
And then there's Kandla Port.
Yes. Kandla Port in Gujarat, which is geographically very close to Karachi, is an absolutely vital economic node for India. It handles the imports and exports for a massive productive industrial belt that stretches deep into northern India, including Jammu and Kashmir, Punjab, Haryana, and Rajasthan.
So a disruption at Kandla isn't just a local problem.
No, it's an instant crisis for India's entire northern economy.
That makes the counter-blockade strategy seem entirely rational, but let me challenge this analysis just a bit. Given India's superior naval capacity, isn't attempting a counter-blockade more likely to lead to an immediate and decisive defeat for the Pakistan Navy, which could potentially force an even quicker escalation?
That's the billion-dollar question, isn't it? And Commander Khan implicitly recognizes that risk. The goal of the counter-blockade, I think, is less about achieving total victory at sea and more about establishing what you might call escalation parity.
Explain that.
It's about drawing Indian resources away from the land battle. If the Indian Navy has to divert significant assets, maybe a whole carrier group, to protect Mumbai or Kandla, then those assets aren't free to support the IBGs in the south. It's a calculated risk. It's aimed at maximizing leverage through the threat of economic disruption rather than solely through a conventional naval battle they know they probably can't win.
So the viability of this naval response is what makes the whole strategic environment so dangerously balanced.
Precisely.
Okay, if we connect this to the bigger picture, the entire framework for regional stability in the Indian Ocean, which historically acted as a constraint on conflict, is, according to the source, fundamentally changing.
It is. And it's largely due to external factors. This change creates a strategic vacuum that directly impacts how cold start might be employed or countered.
Historically, that stability was maintained by the omnipresent force of the U.S. Navy. Why does the source suggest the U.S. Navy is now in distress?
Commander Khan points out that the U.S. Navy, specifically U.S. Naval Forces Central Command, has historically guaranteed security and stability across the Indian Ocean, securing vital choke points for global trade. But his argument back in 2011 was that the prolonged engagement in wars in Iraq and Afghanistan has sucked the oxygen out of strategic long-term planning.
A redirection of focus and resources.
Exactly. And that has led to a perceptible decline in global influence.
How does this distress manifest practically in the fleet itself?
Well, it means reduced budgets, chronic crew shortages, and crucially, less realistic training time. The analysis uses a very stark example. The 2009 grounding of the guided missile cruiser USS Port Royal.
I remember that.
It exposed these deep systemic issues, like a sleep-deprived commanding officer and chronic manning shortfalls. That incident was seen globally as symbolic of the U.S. fleet's increasingly distressed fortunes in the post-Cold War era. It reinforced the perception that the U.S. is losing its ability to shape the strategic environment in Asia.
So a vacuum is created. And nature abhors a vacuum, especially in geopolitics. Who is poised to fill this space left by a declining U.S. presence?
Inevitably, the analysis suggests the void will be filled by the new rising naval power, China's People's Liberation Army Navy, the PLA Navy. This strategic alteration fundamentally destabilizes the regional balance that India's CSD doctrine kind of relies on.
And India is already reacting to this potential shift by trying to establish itself as the regional power broker.
Precisely. India has moved rapidly to militarize the region by launching its first nuclear submarine, the S-2, which is the INS Ariane. This shifts the dynamic from conventional to nuclear deterrence at sea.
And there's a partnership with the U.S.
Right. If the U.S. Navy, facing its own budgetary constraints and platform fatigue, begins to outsource security functions to India, this effectively allows India to confer upon itself the role of regional policeman.
What does that term regional policeman imply in this context from Pakistan's perspective?
Well, it implies India taking on the mantle of guaranteeing maritime security across the Indian Ocean. Now, this sounds benign, but for Pakistan and for China, it means India assumes the right to dictate navigation, monitor traffic, and essentially control the region, a form of regional dominance that neither Islamabad nor Beijing finds acceptable.
And this perceived Indian dominance naturally drives a counteralignment.
It sets the stage for a major strategic alliance. Commander Khan forecasts that the Pakistan Navy and the PLA Navy will forge a new, decisive strategic partnership to actively reshape the maritime environment.
And China's naval power is growing exponentially.
At the time of writing, the source projected that the PLA Navy could deploy more than one aircraft carrier by 2015, which would dramatically expand its power projection capabilities deep into the Indian Ocean.
That projection, combined with a U.S. retreat, creates a massive strategic problem for India.
It really does. What the Indian strategic community previously feared and labeled as the encirclement, this idea of a string of pearls, Chinese-linked ports and alliances ringing the subcontinent, will then become a palpable military reality.
And the result?
The author concludes that when multiple nuclear powers, now backed by massive external naval forces, begin competing for dominance in this shrinking void, the entire Indian Ocean will scream for stability. This strategic imbalance only increases the risk of miscalculation if a fast strike doctrine like CSD is ever activated.
Okay, here it is. The absolute crux of the issue, where the high speed of the doctrine meets the existential threat. Cold Start is designed to achieve gains short of the nuclear threshold. Why does Commander Khan believe this calculation is so fatally flawed?
The whole doctrine, CSD, is predicated on an assumption. And it's a huge assumption. It assumes that India can deliver a limited, punitive blow and that Pakistan will simply absorb that loss rather than initiate nuclear use.
So India's calculus is that by keeping the conflict geographically and temporally limited, the burden of escalation falls entirely on Islamabad if they choose to cross that nuclear line.
Exactly. India can say, look, we kept it conventional. They're the ones who went nuclear.
But the conventional realities on the ground make Pakistan's response predictable, don't they? What is at the core Pakistani predicament that makes strategic patience almost impossible?
The core issue is the massive conventional military asymmetry that favors India, coupled with Pakistan's catastrophic lack of what's called strategic depth.
For our listeners, strategic depth refers to the geographical distance between the border and a country's vital centers, right?
Exactly. It's political, economic, and military centers. In Pakistan, the core areas, the plains of Punjab, which contain cities like Lahore, major military cantonments, and key industrial infrastructure, are located extremely close to the border, sometimes only tens of miles away.
So, if an IBG, moving at that lightning speed, penetrates 30 to 50 miles, they are essentially sitting in Pakistan's strategic heartland. There's no large buffer zone or desert to trade for time like you might find in other countries.
Precisely. In the 72 to 96 hours that CSD allows, a fast-moving integrated IBG could be threatening Lahore or cutting off key military supply lines. This geographic vulnerability means Pakistan has no time or space to maneuver conventionally. That lack of strategic depth eliminates the option of a protracted conventional defense.
Which is why the author calls CSD an exceedingly ambitious and dangerous concept.
It is. This strategic pressure creates a fatal escalation trap.
So how is Pakistan likely to respond if they fail to preempt India's CSD thrust?
Since losing that territory within 96 hours would constitute an unacceptable existential threat to the state, and diplomacy would be far too slow to help, the only remaining option on the table is the nuclear one.
A tactical nuclear strike.
The conventional pressure created by CSD could force Pakistan's military leadership to make the decision to use low-yield tactical nuclear weapons, like the Nasr missile, specifically designed to dislodge or neutralize an advancing integrated battle group that has penetrated deep into their vital territory.
And what does India's own nuclear doctrine state happens after a low-yield tactical nuclear weapon is used against its forces? Does it allow for a limited tit-for-tat response?
Absolutely not. India's nuclear doctrine is unequivocally clear. It allows for no ambiguity on this point. They state that even the use of a single low-yield tactical nuclear weapon against Indian forces, regardless of where or how it is used, will invite a massive retaliatory strike from India's full arsenal.
Which means the ultimate risk is that CSD, a doctrine designed to be a limited conventional punishment, becomes the fuse for a nuclear Armageddon. The conventional maneuver essentially eliminates the crucial firebreak between conventional conflict and a full-scale nuclear exchange.
That is the tragic inevitability that Commander Khan describes. The speed and the strategic asymmetry eliminate the middle ground. It forces Pakistan into a binary choice. either accept a crippling conventional defeat that undermines their sovereignty, or cross the nuclear line, knowing full well that India has promised a massive response.
And that mechanism where speed forces tactical nuclear use, which in turn guarantees massive nuclear retaliation, is the core thesis of the article.
It is. This, he says, would be the beginning of Armageddon.
Does India's own behavior indicate that their political leadership fully grasps the catastrophic risks inherent in actually executing CSD?
Well, the most compelling evidence of internal hesitation, or what the author calls dithering politico-military minds, is the fact that India did not implement Cold Start following the devastating 26/11 Mumbai attacks in 2008.
And if ever there was a justifiable casus belli for a rapid punitive strike, 26/11 was it.
Without a doubt. The fact that India chose restraint instead of execution suggests a deep underlying realization of the extreme danger involved in actually putting this not-so-cold plan into action. It shows that the political price of triggering a conventional to nuclear war might be far too high, even if the military doctrine technically permits it.
So to summarize the core tension here, Cold Start is a brilliant military solution to India's conventional mobilization problem that they faced back in 2002. It's designed to deliver gains in less than 96 hours. But its success fundamentally hinges on this terrifying assumption that Pakistan will submit to this conventional pressure rather than activating a low-yield nuclear response, a choice that guarantees mass nuclear retaliation.
And this deep dive really confirms that the danger is amplified by the shifting geopolitics. You have this conventional asymmetry meeting a doctrine designed to eliminate time for negotiation, and this is all happening at the very moment the historical global security guarantor, the U.S. Navy, is pulling back, opening the door for new, potentially destabilizing alliances like the Pakistan-PLA partnership.
And that brings us to our final provocative thought for you, our listener, to consider as you reflect on the strategic landscape. We've explored how the decline of the U.S. Navy creates a regional power vacuum, potentially encouraging strategic alliances like the Pakistan-PLA naval partnership. So consider this. If such a partnership were to become a credible counterweight to Indian dominance in the Indian Ocean, would this actually increase or decrease a risk of escalation when a rapid strike doctrine like Cold Start is employed? Does the introduction of a new major power balance in the maritime domain make CSD less likely to succeed and therefore less likely to be used? Or does it simply increase the number of players who might stumble into the mechanism of Armageddon?